Papa, she looks like Mommy. The whisper landed like a gunshot in Samuel Harper's chest. 3 years he'd kept his heart frozen. 3 years he'd sworn never to care again. But the woman standing alone in the snow wedding dress, ruined nowhere to go, looked exactly like the ghost he'd been running from. And his daughter had just asked the one question that could break him. Montana Territory, December 1884, Papa. She looks like Mommy. The whisper came from the wagon seat beside him, small and uncertain, but it landed like a gunshot in Samuel Harper's chest. His hands tightened on the reins. The horses slowed without command, as if they too understood that something fundamental had shifted in the cold Montana air. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Snow hung suspended between earth and sky. Breath froze in Samuel's lungs. Sound disappeared into the vast white silence that swallowed everything in winter on the frontier. Samuel did not turn right away because he already knew what would happen if he did. 3 years of careful distance, 3 years of walls built brick by painful brick, 3 years of learning how to keep breathing when breathing hurt. All of it balanced on this single moment. But then he looked. A woman stood alone on the platform at Red Hollow Station. Her back bent slightly against the wind shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, invisible, less of a burden to the winter that pressed down on her like judgment itself. She wore a wedding dress ruined by snow and soot, the white fabric turned gray and dingy, the hem soaked through and clinging to her boots. Ice crystals formed in the delicate lace at her throat. Her shoulders trembled. Not with cold, though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Not with wind, though it cut across the platform with the sharp edge of a blade. She trembled with the kind of breaking that happens inside where no one else can see, where dignity tries and fails to hold back the tide of complete collapse. She looked small against the wide Montana winter. Small and forgotten. Like something the world had stopped protecting because it no longer remembered she existed. Samuel should have driven on. He knew that with the certainty of a man who had spent years teaching himself exactly that skill. Drive on, don't stop, don't look back, don't let yourself hope or help or care, because caring only leads to loss, and loss leads to the kind of pain that never truly ends. He had Emma to think about. His daughter, 4 years old, sitting beside him on the wagon bench with her blue eyes too serious for a child, her small hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders. He had a ranch to run cattle, to feed a life that had finally achieved something like balance after years of barely holding together. Stopping for a stranger was not part of that carefully maintained equilibrium. But Emma's words hung in the frozen air between them. She looks like Mommy. And Samuel Harper, widower, father man, who had sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again, felt something crack deep in the frozen wasteland of his chest. Winter had come early to Montana Territory in 1884. The kind of winter that didn't ask permission. Snow had buried the railroad tracks in drifts 6 feet high. Trains screamed through the plains hours late, if they came at all, their whistles echoing across the emptiness like the cries of dying things. Red Hollow Station was nothing more than a platform, a weathered shack with a potbelly stove, and the kind of silence that made lonely thoughts louder. The settlement itself sat another 2 miles down a rutted path that turned to impassable mud in spring and frozen stone in winter. A handful of buildings clustered together as if proximity might provide safety from the vast indifference of the landscape. It did not. The woman's name was Catherine Brennan, though no one at the station knew it yet. No one had asked. No one had cared enough to ask. She stood where the eastbound train had left her 3 hours before, watching the smoke dissolve into the steel-colored skunk. In her gloved hand, she clutched a return ticket she hadn't requested. In the other, a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world and everything she had lost. The dress had taken 3 months to sew, long nights by candlelight when her mother's sister had already gone to bed, when the house fell quiet except for the tick of the clock and the whisper of thread through fabric. Her fingers had bled. Small pricks from the needle, tiny spots of red on white lace that she had to wash out carefully, terrified of leaving a stain, terrified that even this one thing she could control might be ruined by her own carelessness. Each stitch had held a hope. Each seam had contained a prayer. This dress would carry her into a new life. This dress would transform Catherine Brennan, unwanted ward of a reluctant aunt, into Mrs. Thomas Wheeler, respected wife of a Montana rancher. This dress would prove that she could be chosen, wanted, valued. 4 days ago, the man she was meant to marry had married someone else. Catherine stared at the snow at her feet, unable to move. The cold had worked its way into her bones, past her skin, past her flesh, into the very core of her, until thinking felt heavy, until movement seemed impossible, until the simple act of continuing to exist required more strength than she possessed. The station master had offered directions to a boarding house 2 miles into town. She hadn't answered. Couldn't answer. The words had formed in her mind but died before reaching her throat. Walking felt impossible. Tomorrow felt worse. Continuing felt like a cruelty she could not inflict upon herself. Samuel watched her from the wagon jaw, tight, every muscle in his body locked against the pull he felt toward this stranger in her ruined dress. Beside him, Emma shifted on the bench, her small body leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the woman with an intensity that made Samuel's throat constrict. "She smells sad," Emma whispered so quietly Samuel almost didn't hear it, like Mommy did, when she stopped singing. Samuel flinched as if struck. The words pierced through defenses he had thought impenetrable, found the wound that never healed pressed against it until the pain flared bright and sharp and impossible to ignore. Sarah had stopped singing 2 days before she died. That was how Samuel had known, really known, that she was leaving him. Not the fever, not the labored breathing, the silence where music had been. He wrapped the reins around the brake. The wagon came to a stop, and with it, the life Samuel Harper had been barely holding together began to crack open. Samuel climbed down from the wagon slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter what little balance he had left. His boots crunched through the fresh snow. The sound seemed too loud in the stillness, an intrusion on the woman's private grief. She did not look up when he stopped a few paces away. Her face was turned slightly aside, lashes clumped with frozen tears, cheeks pale and raw from the cold, in something deeper than cold. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her hands, even in their gloves, shook with fine tremors that spoke of a body reaching the limits of its endurance. "You all right, miss?" he asked. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears. Too rough, too unused to gentleness, too stripped of anything that might pass for comfort. 3 years of speaking only when necessary, of conversations limited to what Emma needed and what the ranch hands required, and nothing more had left his voice rusty with disuse. The woman tried to answer. He saw her lips move, saw her draw breath, saw her reach for whatever words she thought might explain or excuse or simply acknowledge. But nothing came. Whatever she had meant to say died in her throat, choked by cold or shame or exhaustion so profound it had stolen even the comfort of speech. She shook her head once. A small movement, barely perceptible, but it said more than 1,000 words could have. It said there was no all right left in her. It said she had traveled beyond the reach of simple reassurances. It said she was drowning and knew it and had stopped fighting the current pulling her under. Samuel followed her gaze down to the object she held. The wedding dress with its careful stitching and blood-stained hope. The carpet bag, worn but sturdy, containing the practical remains of a life that had promised to be so much more. The return ticket clenched so tightly in her fingers that the paper had begun to tear at the edges. Understanding landed heavy in his chest, a familiar weight he recognized from his own past. Another mail-order bride. Another promise broken. Another dream dying in the Montana snow. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. No, the word was barely audible, a breath more than speech. "No one's coming." Behind him, Samuel heard Emma shift on the wagon seat, heard her boots scuff against wood, heard the rustle of her blanket. He felt her watching him with those blue eyes that saw too much, that missed nothing, that had learned too young how to read the spaces between what adults said and what they meant. Samuel felt the weight of a promise he had made long ago pressing against his ribs like a hand squeezing his heart. Sarah's last words whispered through cracked lips as fever consumed her from within. "Take care of our girl. Don't let her forget love." He had kept the first part of that promise. Emma was fed, clothed, safe. She had a roof over her head and a father who would die before letting harm come to her. But the second part, the harder part, the part about love, he had failed at completely. How could he teach Emma about love when his own heart had turned to stone? How could he show her warmth when he had spent 3 years building walls of ice around everything that mattered? The wind cut sharper across the platform. Snow began to fall again, small dry flakes that stung exposed skin. The woman swayed slightly where she stood, and Samuel saw the truth of it. then saw it with the clarity of someone who had once stood in almost exactly the same spot, waiting for a train that carried his own mail-order bride west to a man she had never met. She wasn't choosing to stay on this platform. Her body had simply run out of strength. Her mind had run out of options. She stood here because standing here required nothing and she had nothing left to give. There's a boarding house, Samuel said, even though he could already hear how hollow the word sounded. In town. Mrs. Turner runs it. Clean place, fair prices. I know. The woman's voice was flat empty of inflection or hope. She didn't move. Samuel exhaled through his nose slow and controlled the way he had learned to breathe through pain, through loss, through the long nights when sleep wouldn't come and morning felt impossibly far away. He turned back to the wagon. Emma watched him, her small face serious, waiting. Samuel lifted his coat from the seat, the heavy wool still warm from his body, and walked back to the woman on the platform. He stepped close enough to smell coal smoke and lavender soap, close enough to see the individual snowflakes caught in her dark hair, close enough that if she looked up, their eyes would meet. But she didn't look up. She stared at the ground as if it held answers she desperately needed, but couldn't read. Samuel settled the coat around her shoulders before she could protest. There, he said quietly, "Don't fight it. You need it more than I do." "I can't take this," she murmured. But even as she spoke, her fingers curled into the wool without permission. Her body knew what it needed, even when her mind was too proud or too broken to accept help. "You'll freeze. I'm used to it." Her fingers tightened in the fabric, pulling it closer, and Samuel saw relief break through her exhaustion like sun through storm clouds. Something in him twisted hard and sharp, a feeling he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even this simple piece of information required more than she had to give. Then so softly he had to lean closer to hear it. "Catherine. Catherine Brennan. Most people call me Kate," Samuel nodded. "Samuel Harper. That's my daughter Emma." Emma gave a solemn little wave from the wagon, her mittened hand moving slowly back and forth. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying across the platform with the pure clarity of childhood. Kate's mouth trembled. She tried to smile, tried to offer back the simple courtesy of acknowledgement, but her face wouldn't cooperate. The smile died before it could form, replaced by something that looked like it might become tears if she let it. "We've got a ranch," Samuel said, each word costing him something he couldn't quantify. "About an hour west of here. There's a fire. Hot food. You can warm up, get your strength back. In the morning, I'll take you wherever you need to go." Kate hesitated. He saw pride flicker in her eyes, saw it war with desperation, saw it lose. "I don't have anywhere," she said. The admission seemed to cost her everything. Her shoulders curved further inward. Her head dropped. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down into depths that had no bottom. Samuel held out his arm, elbow crooked, an old-fashioned gesture from a time when such things mattered, when courtesy could be a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. "Then you won't stand in the cold." Kate looked at his arm for a long moment. Samuel could see her thinking, weighing, calculating risks against necessities. Could see her measuring the danger of going with a strange man against the certainty of freezing to death on this platform. Could see her arrive at the same conclusion the Montana winter had already reached. She had run out of choices. Kate Brennan, abandoned bride with nowhere left to fall, placed her gloved hand on Samuel Harper's arm, and the moment she did, something shifted in the fabric of both their lives, a change too subtle to name, but too profound to ignore. The wagon rolled away from Red Hollow Station without ceremony. No one waved from the small shack where the station master dozed by his stove. No one called out good wishes or warnings. The settlement swallowed them into its indifference and then forgot they had ever been there. Kate sat stiffly on the wagon bench, Samuel's coat pulled tight around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and clean cold air smells that spoke of work and honesty and a life lived close to the land. The warmth of it seeped into her slowly reaching muscles that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Beside her, Emma leaned close. The child radiated heat through layers of wool and flannel, and Kate felt herself drawn toward that small sun, as if towards salvation itself. "You're really a bride?" Emma asked softly, carefully, like she already knew the answer might hurt. "I was," Kate said. Her voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else, someone who still had the right to claim such things. Things changed. Emma thought about that for a long moment her small brow furrowed with the seriousness of someone trying to understand concepts far beyond her years. That's sad, she decided finally. I'm sorry. Thank you, Kate said, and she was surprised by how much it helped to hear those simple words from a child who couldn't possibly understand what had been lost but offered sympathy anyway. Samuel kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The road was nothing more than two narrow ruts through the snow barely visible as daylight faded toward the early dusk of winter. He didn't speak, didn't offer conversation or explanation or the kind of empty reassurances people usually gave in such situations. Silence had become his safest habit, his most reliable companion. Words could be misunderstood. Words could be twisted. Words could create expectations he couldn't meet and promises he couldn't keep. Better to say nothing, better to let actions speak and let silence fill the spaces between. The cold deepened as the sky darkened. Stars began to prick through the clouds overhead, sharp and distant, offering light, but no warmth. Kate's hands shook despite the coat, despite Emma's warmth beside her. The chill hadn't reached her bones yet, or perhaps it had reached them so long ago that she no longer noticed the way a drowning person stops feeling the water after a certain point. How long ago, she asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for miles. Samuel didn't answer at first. His jaw worked as if he was chewing on words, testing them, finding them all inadequate. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear over the creak of the wagon and the crunch of snow under the horse's hooves. 3 years. Kate didn't need to ask what he meant. The way his shoulders locked told her enough. The way his hands tightened on the reins, white-knuckled even through his gloves. The way the silence that followed her question felt like a door closing. I'm sorry, she said, because what else was there to say? So is everyone, Samuel replied, not unkindly but with a finality that said the subject was closed. The wound was not open for discussion. The grief was his own private burden, and he would not share it with a stranger no matter how recently she had become acquainted with her own version of loss. Emma's head drooped against Kate's arm. The wagon rocked gently, a rhythm as old as travel itself, and before long, the child's breathing slowed and deepened into sleep. Her small body went heavy with it, trusting in a way only children could trust, assuming safety because an adult had said so, and children believed what adults told them until the world taught them otherwise. Kate shifted carefully, letting Emma rest against her, more comfortably, afraid to move too much in case she disturbed this fragile trust forming between them. The weight of the child against her side felt both strange and deeply familiar, as if her body remembered something her mind had never known. Lights appeared ahead, small points of gold in the vast darkness. A barn, first solid and dark against the snow. Then a low house barely visible, except for a single window glowing warm and welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney, a gray column against the black sky, proof of life in the wilderness. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake with practiced efficiency. I'll see to the horses, he said. You take her inside. Fire's probably low. There's wood stacked by the hearth. He lifted Emma down first, his large hands gentle on his daughter's small body, and transferred her to Kate's arms. The child stirred but didn't wake, her face slack with sleep, her breath soft against Kate's neck. Then Samuel turned to Kate. His hands found her waist firm and sure, and he lowered her to the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. For a brief moment, they were close enough for Kate to see the line etched deep into his face by weather and grief. Close enough to see the way his eyes held something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't been trained out of him by loss. Grief lived in those lines, visible and raw. But so did something else. Endurance, the kind of strength that came not from never falling, but from standing back up every single time. Then he released her and stepped back, the moment broken, the distance restored. The house was small but solid, built to withstand Montana winters, to keep out wind and cold, and the kind of loneliness that could kill as surely as any blizzard. The door opened easily under Kate's hand, well-maintained, the hinges oiled, everything, speaking of care, even in the midst of grief. Inside, the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, just as Samuel had said. Red embers glowed beneath ash, holding heat but giving little light. Kate laid Emma gently on a chair near the fire, wrapping the child in a quilt that hung over the back, and then turned her attention to the hearth. She fed the firewood piece by piece, coaxing it back to life, watching flames catch and spread. Heat bloomed outward, almost painfully intense, after the cold, reaching frozen skin with the sharp sting of pins and needles. Kate found the coffee by the stove without being told where to look, found the pot and the water and the things needed to make it. She moved without thinking, her body taking over where her mind still struggled, falling into patterns learned long ago when her father was alive, and she had run his household with the efficiency of someone twice her age. Work steadied her. Work gave her purpose. Work meant she wasn't just a burden, wasn't just another mouth to feed, wasn't just charity, accepted by someone too broken to refuse it. Emma stirred in her chair and smiled sleepily at Kate. "Daddy keeps the house nice," she murmured, her words slurred with sleep. "Mostly." Kate smiled back, something fragile and real forming in her chest, something that felt dangerously like belonging. For the first time since the train had left her behind at Red Hollow Station, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. Samuel came in with the smell of snow and horses clinging to him. He stamped his boots by the door, shaking off the worst of the snow, then stopped when he saw the fire burning strong and bright, when he saw Emma half asleep in the chair, when he saw Kate moving through his kitchen with the kind of comfortable efficiency that spoke of competence rather than intrusion. For a moment he just stood there, snow melting on his shoulders, a strange expression flickering across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or confusion? Or something that looked almost like pain. "Water's heating," Kate said softly, careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled over the house like a blanket. "I made coffee. I hope that's all right." "It's fine," he answered, his voice rougher than he had meant it to be, scraped raw by something he couldn't name. He shrugged out of his heavy outer coat and hung it on a peg by the door, not looking at her. Without it, he seemed somehow smaller, more human, less like the impenetrable wall of grief and silence he had been on the wagon ride. The cold didn't seem to touch him at all. He moved through it like he had forgotten what warmth felt like and no longer missed it. Samuel went to the stove and began setting out food with the automatic movements of routine. Bread from a tin box, a pot of stew that must have been made that morning thick with vegetables and meat, plates and spoons laid out with the kind of care that suggested meals were still something that mattered even when eaten alone. "You should change out of that dress," he said without looking at her. "It's soaked through. You'll catch your death." Kate glanced down at the wedding dress she had forgotten she was still wearing. The hem clung to her boots, dark with melted snow and mud from the platform. The beautiful white lace was gray now, stained and ruined, all the hope stitched into it, dissolved like the snow melting on the floor. "I have another dress in my bag," she said. "I left it at the station." Samuel turned, then meeting her eyes for the first time since they had entered the house. "I brought it. Station master handed it over when I asked." Kate's breath caught. "You didn't have to do that, I know." 2 words, simple, factual, carrying no expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement, but somehow they meant more than any grand gesture could have. Before Kate could respond, Emma slid off the chair and took Kate's hand with the easy trust of a child who had decided someone was safe. "You can use Daddy's room," she announced, already tugging Kate down the short hallway. "There's a screen." Kate let herself be led, too tired to protest, too grateful for the simple kindness to question it. The room was exactly what she expected. Simple, spare, nothing wasted. A bed neatly made, a chest of drawers, a folding screen in the corner. Behind the screen, Kate worked the tiny buttons of her wedding dress with numb fingers that fumbled and slipped. Several buttons fell free and vanished into the gaps between the floorboards. Small pieces of her old life disappearing into darkness where she couldn't retrieve them. When the fabric finally dropped away, she stood shivering in her undergarments, staring at the dress in a heap at her feet. 3 months of work, 3 months of hope, all of it lying crumpled in ruin, just another broken promise in a life that seemed to collect them like some people collected coins. She reached for the plain gray wool dress from her bag. It fit the way it always had, practical, unremarkable, designed not to draw attention. The dress of someone who had learned early that being noticed rarely ended well for girls without money or protection. When she returned to the main room, Samuel had set the table. Emma climbed into Kate's lap without asking, settling there as if she had been doing it forever, as if Kate's arms were exactly where she belonged. They ate quietly. Samuel said little, his attention focused on his plate, on the mechanics of eating, rather than the company. Emma said everything, filling the silence with observations and questions and the kind of stream of consciousness chatter that came naturally to lonely children who had learned to provide their own conversation. "Do you like horses?" Emma asked between bites of stew. We have 6. The brown one is my favorite, but Papa says I'm too small to ride her yet. Can you read Mama used to read to me every night? Papa tries, but his voice gets sad. Do you get sad? I get sad sometimes, but Papa says that's normal. What's Boston like? Is it bigger than Bitter Creek? I've never been anywhere except here. Kate answered when she could offer smiles when words failed, and felt something in her chest begin to thaw. Not healing, not yet, but the first tentative acknowledgement that healing might be possible. By the time the dishes were done and the fire banked for the night, the house felt warmer. Not just from the flames in the hearth, but from something less tangible. From presence, from the sound of voices, from Emma's laughter when Kate made a silly face, from Samuel's almost smile when his daughter said something particularly clever. When it came time for sleep, Samuel didn't hesitate. You take the bed, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll use the chair. I can't take your bed, Kate protested. But even as she said it, she knew she didn't have the strength to fight him. You will. 2 words again, simple and absolute. Kate didn't have the energy to argue even if she had wanted to. Emma led her back down the hall, helped her find extra blankets, and then threw her small arms around Kate's waist in an unexpected hug. I'm glad you came, Emma whispered. I prayed for someone nice. God sent you. Then the child was gone, her footsteps pattering back down the hall, leaving Kate standing in the doorway of Samuel Harper's bedroom, with tears sliding down her face. Later, lying beneath heavy quilts that smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine, Kate listened to the slow creak of the rocking chair in the other room. Samuel keeping watch, always keeping watch. A man who had learned that sleep was a luxury grief couldn't always afford. In the darkness, tears slid silently into her hair, soaking into the pillow that wasn't hers in a house that wasn't hers with people she had no right to care about. She had been ready to disappear that afternoon, ready to let the cold and the loneliness and the weight of all her failures pull her under and be done with it. And instead, a stranger had stopped. In the other room, Samuel Harper stared into the dying fire and wondered why he had. Wondered what madness had possessed him to bring a strange woman into his home, into Emma's life, into the carefully controlled emptiness he had built around his broken heart. She looks like Mommy, Emma had said, and God help him, she did. Not in features, not exactly. Sarah had been blonde where this woman was dark. Sarah had been small and delicate where this woman was taller, stronger. But there was something in the curve of her cheek, in the way she held herself despite being broken, in the quiet dignity that refused to bend even when everything else had. Sarah had stood on that same platform 8 years ago, a mail-order bride traveling west to marry a man she had never met, terrified and brave, and holding herself together through sheer force of will. Samuel had almost not gone to meet her, had stood in his barn that morning, convincing himself that marriage was a mistake, that he was better off alone, that bringing a stranger into his life would end badly. But he had gone, had driven that wagon to Red Hollow Station, had found Sarah standing there in her traveling dress, with her small trunk at her feet, and fear and hope warring in her eyes. Best decision he had ever made. Until pneumonia had ripped her away 3 years later, leaving him with a daughter too young to remember her mother's face and a hole in his chest so big he could feel the wind blow through it. He had sworn then, no more caring, no more hoping, no more letting anyone close enough to destroy him when they left. Because everyone left eventually. Death or distance or disappointment, it didn't matter. The leaving was inevitable. The pain was guaranteed. And yet tonight he had stopped. Tonight he had offered his coat. Tonight he had brought a stranger home. Samuel closed his eyes and listened to the silence of his house, broken now by the sound of breathing from the room down the hall. 2 people breathing where for 3 years there had been only 1 child and 1 broken man. He told himself it was temporary. Told himself she would be gone in the morning, back to the boarding house, back to wherever broken brides went when their dreams died in the Montana snow. But a small, traitorous part of his heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, some things were meant to be found, even by people who had stopped looking. Dawn crept into the house, slowly, pale light slipping through the frost-laced window like an unwelcome guest. Kate woke to the steady sound of an axe striking wood, the rhythm controlled and relentless, like someone working to keep his thoughts at bay. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling, the weight of quilts that weren't hers, the faint scent of wood smoke and coffee drifting through the air. Then memory returned in a rush that made her chest tighten. The station, the snow, Samuel's coat heavy on her shoulders, Emma's small hand in hers. She sat up carefully aware that she was still wearing the gray wool dress she had put on the night before, too exhausted to change into a nightgown, even if she had owned one suitable for a stranger's house. The dress was wrinkled now, creased from sleep, but it was warm and modest, and those were the only things that mattered. Emma slept on in the small bed pushed against the far wall, one hand curled beneath her cheek, her breathing soft and even. Kate watched her for a moment, feeling an ache settle deep in her chest. An ache she didn't understand and wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely. In the main room, coffee steamed on the stove, the pot already made the fire already crackling with fresh wood. Through the window, Kate could see Samuel in the yard splitting wood with sharp, efficient swings. He worked like the cold was nothing like pain, was something he could outpace if he moved fast enough. Kate poured a cup and wrapped her hands around it, drawing warmth from the tin mug. The coffee was strong, black as night, the way men who worked hard drank it. She sipped it slowly, letting the bitter heat burn away the fog of sleep. What now? The question sat heavy in her mind, demanding an answer she didn't have. She had a return ticket east, a future that led backward to a place where she wasn't wanted. The ticket sat in her carpet bag, a constant reminder that she had somewhere to go, even if going there meant admitting defeat. But staying here wasn't an option either. Charity always came with an end. People's goodness ran out, eventually worn down by the simple reality that feeding another mouth and providing another bed cost money that most frontier families didn't have to spare. Samuel came in bringing the cold with him. Ice crystals clung to his hair and beard. His face was red from the wind, his breath coming in small clouds. He nodded once, a greeting compressed into a gesture efficient as everything else about him. "You're up," he said. "I should head into town today," Kate replied, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "I don't want to overstay your hospitality." Samuel set out oatmeal and motioned for her to eat, ignoring her statement as if she hadn't spoken. "You'll need strength," he said. "It's a long ride." The words stung more than Kate expected. Ride. As in, he would take her away. As in, this brief respite was already ending. She had known it was coming, had expected nothing else, but somehow the confirmation still felt like a door closing on something she hadn't even known she wanted. Emma emerged from the bedroom, then hair tangled, eyes bright when she saw Kate. "You're still here," she said, as if she had genuinely feared Kate might disappear during the night, like morning mist. "For now," Kate said gently, kneeling to be at the child's eye level. Emma's smile faded. "But you're coming back, right?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Emma," he said, a warning in his tone. "I have to figure some things out first, sweetheart," Kate said, taking the child's hands in hers. "But I'll remember you. I promise I'll remember you." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Everybody leaves," she said, and the words cut deeper than any accusation. They were simple fact delivered with the resignation of someone who had learned too young that loss was inevitable and attachment was just a precursor to pain. Samuel turned away, staring out the window at the white landscape beyond. "Get dressed," he said to his daughter, his voice carefully controlled. "We're going into town." The ride to Bitter Creek was quiet in a way that felt heavy, laden with things unsaid. Emma sat between them, small and tense, her usual chatter replaced by silence. Kate felt the weight of the child's disappointment like a physical thing pressing against her ribs. Samuel helped Kate down in front of a weathered boarding house, the sign out front proclaiming it Turner's in faded letters. The building was 2 stories, well-maintained, despite its age, with lace curtains in the windows and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. "Mrs. Turner runs it," Samuel said, handing Kate her carpet bag. "Tell her I sent you. She's fair." Before Kate could respond, Emma suddenly thrust something into her hand, a faded pink ribbon worn soft with age and handling. "It was Mommy's," the child whispered, her voice breaking. "So you remember us." Kate knelt in the snow, not caring that the cold soaked through her dress. She tied the ribbon around her wrist with fingers that trembled, tears blurring her vision. "I'll remember," she promised. "I'll remember every single day." Emma threw her arms around Kate's neck, holding on with the desperate strength of someone who knew this might be goodbye. Kate held her back, breathing in the child's scent of sleep and soap and innocence, committing it to memory because memory was all she would have. Samuel didn't look at Kate as he climbed back onto the wagon, didn't offer any parting words or promises to check on her. He simply released the brake and clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled away down the muddy street. Kate stood on the porch of Turner's boarding house and watched them go, her chest aching in a way that felt worse than the station had ever felt. Some losses came quietly without warning. Others taught you what home felt like just before taking it away. The boarding house smelled of bread and soap and other people's lives. Kate stood just inside the doorway, her carpet bag at her feet, the pink ribbon warm against her wrist like a pulse that hadn't faded yet. Mrs. Turner was a solid woman with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She studied Kate once, taking in everything from the damp hem to the bare ring finger to the ribbon tied carefully around her wrist, and nodded as if a conclusion had already been reached. "You'll want tea," she said. It wasn't a question. "Then we'll talk." Kate nodded, grateful not to explain herself right away, grateful for the simple kindness of assumption rather than interrogation. Through the lace curtain of the front parlor, Kate saw Samuel's wagon still in the street. Emma was talking animatedly, her hands moving clearly, pleading for something. Samuel shook his head once, then again, his face set in the stubborn lines of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't be moved. Then he climbed down from the wagon, knelt in the snow, and pulled his daughter into his arms. They stayed that way longer than necessary. Samuel's large frame curled around Emma's small one, his hand cradling the back of her head. Kate could see his lips moving, could see him saying something that made Emma nod, could see the child wipe her eyes. Then he stood, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away without looking back. Kate turned from the window before the ache could break her open completely. Mrs. Turner returned with tea and 2 slices of bread, still warm from the oven. She set them on the small table by the window and settled into the chair across from Kate with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. "Samuel Harper brought you," she said. "Not a question, just a statement of observed fact. Yes, mail-order bride." Kate's hands tightened on the teacup. "Yes. Man didn't show, no." Mrs. Turner nodded, her expression unchanging. "Happened to me once," she said. "Back in '67. Came all the way from Pennsylvania to marry a miner in California. Got there and found out he'd been dead 3 months. Cave in. Nobody thought to write and tell me." Kate looked up, surprised by the admission. "I know what it feels like," Mrs. Turner continued. "Like you've fallen off the edge of the world and nobody noticed. Like you don't exist anymore except as somebody's mistake." "Yes," Kate whispered. "Exactly like that." The older woman poured more tea, her movements brisk and efficient. "You can stay here long as you need. I charge by the week, but I'm flexible for folks in difficulty. You any good with numbers? Kept my father's books for 5 years. Then you can help me with mine. I'm terrible at arithmetic, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. We'll call it even for the room." Kate felt something loosen in her chest. "You don't have to do that. I know I don't. I'm doing it anyway." Mrs. Turner stood brushing crumbs from her apron. "Now eat that bread before it gets cold. You're thin as a rail and we're going to fix that." That night, Kate took the small upstairs room Mrs. Turner offered. It was clean and spare, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street of Bitter Creek. She unpacked slowly, carefully, as if the order might settle her thoughts. She found work helping Mrs. Turner with the boarding house accounts. The numbers came easily to her, familiar and comforting in their absolute certainty. Unlike people, unlike promises, unlike hope, numbers always added up the way they were supposed to. Days passed. The rhythm of the boarding house became familiar. Wake before dawn to help with breakfast. Spend the morning on accounts. Afternoons mending linens or helping with whatever needed doing. Evenings sitting by the fire in the common room, listening to the other boarders talk about their days. Bitter Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and Kate's story spread through town like fire through dry grass. The abandoned bride, the woman Samuel Harper had brought back to his ranch. Pity followed her like a shadow, well-intentioned but suffocating. Then 2 weeks after she had arrived, Kate heard a voice she never wanted to hear again. Miss Brennan. She turned in the general store, her hands full of the fabric Mrs. Turner had sent her to buy, and saw Emma running toward her. The child's face was lit with joy, like sunrise, her boots clattering on the wooden floor, her braids flying behind her. "You stayed," Emma said breathlessly, throwing her arms around Kate's waist. "You didn't disappear." Samuel stood in the doorway behind his daughter, hat in his hands, uncomfortable and guarded in the way of men who didn't like being the center of attention. His eyes found Kate's across the store, and something passed between them. A question maybe, or an acknowledgement of something neither was ready to name. They spoke little. Emma begged. Samuel resisted, his jaw set in stubborn lines. But somehow, before Kate fully understood how it had happened, she had agreed to come to the ranch for Sunday dinner. One meal. That was all. A chance for Emma to see that Kate was well, that she hadn't vanished, that some people did keep their promises even when it cost them something. Neither Kate nor Samuel fully trusted what was happening between them, but they both trusted Emma. And for now, that was enough. Sunday came faster than Kate expected and slower than she wanted. She woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves that had no rational source. It was just dinner, just a few hours, just a chance to see Emma again. But her hands shook as she dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that had belonged to her mother and still fit reasonably well. Her hands shook as she pinned her hair, trying to make herself look presentable, trying not to think about why it suddenly mattered how she looked. Samuel arrived at the boarding house at precisely 10 o'clock, driving the same wagon, wearing what she suspected was his only good shirt. Emma bounced on the seat beside him, barely able to contain her excitement. The ranch looked different in daylight, less haunted, more alive. The barn stood solid and well-maintained. The fences were straight and strong. The house itself, while small, showed signs of care in every detail. This was a place built to last, built by someone who took pride in his work, even when his heart was broken. Emma grabbed Kate's hand the moment she stepped down from the wagon and didn't let go, dragging her toward the house with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a great treasure. Inside, the main room had been tidied beyond its usual neatness. Fresh flowers sat on the table, wildflowers that must have taken someone considerable effort to find in late December. The fire burned bright and warm. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. Samuel had cooked, not just reheated something made days before, but actually cooked. A roast that looked surprisingly competent, potatoes that were only slightly burnt, bread that was dense but edible. Kate felt something shift in her chest at the sight of his effort. This man, who spoke in single syllables and hid behind walls of silence, had spent hours preparing a meal because his daughter had asked him to. Because making Kate welcome mattered to Emma, and Emma's happiness was the only thing that could move him. Dinner was easier than expected. Emma filled the silence with stories and questions and observations that made both adults smile despite themselves. Samuel served food with careful attention, making sure Kate had enough, that her glass stayed full, that she wanted for nothing. When the meal was done and the dishes cleared, Emma begged Kate to read to her. They settled by the fire, the child curled against Kate's side like she belonged there, while Kate read from a battered copy of fairy tales that had clearly been read many times before. Samuel sat across from them in the rocking chair that Kate now knew was where he spent his sleepless nights. He didn't read or work or occupy himself with anything else. He just sat and watched his daughter smile, watched her lean against this woman who had been a stranger 2 weeks ago, watched something he had thought dead begin to stir back to life. Kate felt his eyes on her but didn't look up, didn't want to break the fragile peace that had settled over the house like blessing. When Emma finally dozed off in Kate's arms, Samuel stood and gently lifted his daughter, carrying her to her small bed with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times. When he returned, Kate was standing, preparing to leave to end this before it became something more complicated than it already was. "I enjoyed today," Samuel said quietly, the words clearly costing him something. "So did I," Kate replied. They stood in awkward silence, the fire crackling between them, neither quite knowing what came next. "Emma wants you to come back," Samuel said finally. "For Christmas, if you're willing." Kate's throat tightened. "I'd like that." 4 days later, Emma arrived at the boarding house alone. Mrs. Turner found Kate in the small office where she kept the books and told her there was a visitor. Kate came downstairs to find Emma standing in the front hall, snow-dusted, and frightened, her small face pale. "Daddy's sick," Emma said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He won't stay in bed. He keeps trying to work. I'm scared." Kate didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and medical supplies Mrs. Turner kept for emergencies, told the older woman where she was going, and climbed up beside Emma onto the small pony the child had clearly ridden alone through miles of snow. The ride back to the ranch felt endless. Emma talked the whole way, her words running together, explaining how her father had been fine yesterday, how he'd woken this morning with fever, how he'd insisted he had to feed the animals even though he could barely stand. When they arrived, Kate found Samuel in the barn mucking stalls with the mechanical determination of someone who refused to admit weakness. His face was flushed with fever, his movements unsteady, his breathing labored. "You need to be in bed," Kate said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Cattle need feeding." Samuel replied, his voice rough. "The cattle can wait. You can't." He tried to argue, but the fever had stolen his strength. When Kate took his arm, he leaned on her more heavily than pride would normally allow and let her guide him back to the house. The fever was bad, worse than Kate had feared when Emma first appeared at the boarding house. Samuel's temperature climbed through the afternoon despite cold compresses and willow bark tea. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing Kate, sometimes calling her Sarah, sometimes talking to people who weren't there. Emma sat vigil by her father's bedside, her small face serious, her hands clasped in prayer. Kate sent her to bed when the child's eyes began to droop, promising to wake her if anything changed, promising her father would be all right, even though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. On the second night, Samuel's fever spiked to dangerous levels. His skin burned to the touch. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. Kate sponged him down with cool water, changed the compresses on his forehead every few minutes, forced water between his cracked lips, drop by drop. And when she thought no one could hear, when Emma was finally asleep and the house was dark except for firelight, Kate sang old hymns her mother had taught her, lullabies she remembered from childhood, songs that had no words, just melodies that spoke of comfort and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let go. On the third morning, Samuel's fever broke just before dawn. Kate had been awake all night watching for any change, any sign that he was slipping away or fighting back. She saw the exact moment when the crisis passed, when his breathing eased, when the flush faded from his cheeks. His eyes opened clear and aware for the first time in 3 days. "You stayed," he said hoarsely, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Of course I did," Kate replied, relief hitting her so hard her hands trembled. Samuel's gaze moved around the room, taking in the damp cloths, the basin of water, the chair pulled close to his bed, where Kate had clearly spent days and nights keeping watch. "Emma," he asked, "asleep. She didn't leave your side until I made her." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, something that looked like wonder mixed with fear. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," Kate said firmly, "I did." "Why?" "Because I love her." The words came out before Kate could stop them, raw and honest and impossible to take back. "Because she's already lost too much. Because I couldn't bear to see her lose you too." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were wet. His hand moved weak but deliberate, reaching for hers where it rested on the blanket. "So have you," he said quietly, "lost too much." The truth of it settled between them, a recognition of shared wounds of understanding born from similar scars. Samuel recovered slowly over the next week. Kate stayed at the ranch, sleeping in the chair by his bed at first, then on the small cot Emma dragged in from the barn. She fed him broth when he could manage. It read to him when he was too weak to do more than listen, changed bandages, and monitored his temperature with the efficiency of someone who had nursed sick family members before. Emma blossomed with both adults in the house. She chattered constantly, brought her father flowers she made from scraps of fabric, insisted on helping Kate with everything from cooking to washing to tending the animals. One afternoon, when Samuel could finally sit up without dizziness, he asked the question Kate had been waiting for. "You could have gone back to town when the worst was past. You didn't." Kate met his eyes steadily. "No, I didn't." "Why?" She considered lying, considered offering some practical explanation about wanting to make sure he was truly recovered, about feeling responsible since Emma had come to her for help. But she was tired of lies, tired of hiding, tired of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "I wasn't waiting anymore," she said simply. Samuel held her gaze for a long moment. Waiting for what? For permission to care. For someone to tell me it was safe to hope. For a sign that maybe I could have a place in the world after all. Emma woke from her nap to find them talking and smiled like the world had been set right. "Daddy's better," she announced with absolute certainty. "That means Miss Kate has to stay." Samuel looked at Kate, fear and hope colliding in his expression. "I don't want to trap you here," he said quietly, his voice still rough from illness. "You deserve a choice. You deserve better than accepting whatever situation you fall into, because you don't have anywhere else to go. I know, Kate replied, her heart pounding, and I choose to stay. For now, to see what this is. To see if maybe we can build something real. Relief crossed Samuel's face, followed quickly by something deeper. Gratitude. Want. The first tentative stirrings of hope in a heart that had been frozen for 3 years. Days passed slowly as Samuel regained his strength. Kate slept by the fire at night, keeping careful distance, but the air between them had changed fundamentally. Touch lingered when they passed each other in the narrow kitchen. Silence felt full instead of empty. Every small kindness carried weight. Emma seemed to sense the shift and appointed herself their guardian and advocate, constantly creating situations that forced them together. Asking Kate to help her father with tasks. Asking Samuel to show Kate things around the ranch. Innocent suggestions delivered with the knowing smile of a child who understood far more than adults gave her credit for. Then one afternoon in early January, a rider came. Kate saw him first from the kitchen window. A man on an expensive horse, well-dressed for travel riding with the confidence of someone who owned whatever road he traveled. Her stomach dropped. She knew that horse, knew that posture, knew the set of those shoulders and the tilt of that head. William Ashford had found her. The man dismounted with practiced ease, tying his horse to the rail, with movements that spoke of familiarity with such places, despite his obvious wealth. He was handsome in the way of men who had never known hardship. His face unlined, his clothes expensive, his bearing that of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Samuel stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between the stranger and his house, between this intruder and everything he was beginning to care about protecting. "You're on my land," Samuel said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "State your business." William's gaze flicked over him with the dismissive assessment of someone measuring an obstacle rather than meeting an equal. "William Ashford," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "From Boston. I'm here for Miss Brennan." Kate stepped out onto the porch, her hands gripped tight at her sides. "You don't get to call me that anymore," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. William's smile tightened but didn't fade. "Your aunt sent me Catherine, Demirin. You've embarrassed yourself long enough." This arrangement, his eyes swept the ranch with thinly veiled contempt, has gone far enough. Samuel felt Emma's small hand slip into his. He looked down at his daughter, saw fear in her eyes, then back at Kate, reading the terror she was trying to hide behind dignity. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Kate said. "You lost that right when you married someone else while I was on a train to meet you." William's expression hardened. That was a misunderstanding. The other woman, he paused, choosing words carefully. It didn't work out. "I'm willing to forgive your lapse in judgment, your impulsive flight west. Come back to Boston. We'll marry quietly. Your reputation can be restored." "No," William took a step closer. "You choose poverty and shame over respectability, over the life I can give you. I choose honesty over your version of respectability every single time. Think carefully, Catherine." William's voice dropped, taking on an edge. "You're an unmarried woman living unescorted with a widower and his child. In a town like this, reputation matters. You'll ruin yourself. You'll ruin them." The threat was clear as a gunshot. Samuel's jaw set. "You leave now." William laughed, the sound cold and calculated. "You think you can protect her from consequences? I can make sure every decent household in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman she is, what kind of house this is. How long do you think it will be before someone starts asking questions about that little girl's welfare?" Emma squeezed Samuel's hand harder. "Papa," she whispered. Kate stepped forward, her spine straight, her head high. "Give me until tomorrow," she said. "Then you'll have your answer." William studied her satisfaction, spreading across his face like oil. "Very well. Tomorrow evening, I'll be at the hotel in town. Don't make me wait." He rode away without another word, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of frozen mud. Silence fell heavy over the yard. Samuel turned to Kate, anger and fear warring in his eyes. "You don't owe him anything." "I owe Emma safety," Kate said quietly. "If he spreads lies about this household, the authorities could take her away. I've heard of it happening. Children removed from homes deemed morally unsuitable." "Then we end it," Samuel said suddenly. Kate stared at him. "What, we get married today? Montana law allows it. 2 witnesses, a declaration before a minister or judge. He loses his leverage." "Samuel, that's not how this should happen." "It's exactly how it should," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, Samuel Harper's voice carried absolute conviction. Because I won't lose you. Not to him, not to fear, not to what people might say or think or do. Emma looked up between them, hope blazing in her eyes. Does this mean she stays? She asked. Forever, Kate looked at the child she had come to love, at the man who had learned to live again, at the life hanging fragile and brave in front of her, asking to be chosen. They rode into Bitter Creek with the sun barely clearing the mountains, the air sharp enough to make every breath feel like swallowing knives. The sky stretched endless overhead, that particular shade of winter blue that promised cold, and more cold, the kind of day that tested resolve and found most people wanting. Kate sat straight in the wagon, hands folded in her lap, the faded pink ribbon still tied around her wrist. She had changed into the blue wool dress, the one that had been her mother's, because if she was going to marry Samuel Harper, she would do it in something that connected her to the people who had loved her first, who had believed she was worth loving. Samuel held the reins with steady focus, his jaw set in the determined line Kate had come to recognize as his fighting stance. He wore his only good shirt pressed carefully, and someone had trimmed his beard that morning. Kate suspected Emma's hand in that detail. Between them, Emma bounced with barely contained excitement, swinging her legs, her mittened hands gripping the edge of the wagon seat. Is there cake? She asked for the third time since they had left the ranch. Maybe Samuel said his standard answer. If you behave, I will. Emma promised immediately, then grinned. Probably. Mrs. Turner was sweeping her porch when the wagon stopped in front of the boarding house. She took one look at their faces, at Samuel's pressed shirt and Kate's careful hair, and Emma's barely suppressed joy, and dropped the broom with a clatter. Well, she said slowly, a smile spreading across her weathered face. About time. Word traveled through Bitter Creek faster than wind through wheat. By the time Samuel and Kate reached the small church with the crooked steeple, half the town had already gathered. Shopkeepers closed their stores and hung quick signs. Ranch hands rode in from outlying properties. The school teacher dismissed class early, bringing her students to witness history. They came out of curiosity, certainly. Small towns fed on gossip the way cattle fed on grass, and the story of Samuel Harper and the abandoned bride had been the primary topic of conversation for weeks. But they came for other reasons too. Because Samuel was one of their own, a man who had suffered loss and kept going, who worked hard and raised his daughter right. Because Kate had proven herself in the quiet way frontier women recognized through competence and dignity, and refusing to bend when lesser people would have broken. And because some of them remembered Sarah. Remembered when she had arrived on that same train, another mail-order bride, another woman taking a chance on a hard land and an uncertain future. Remembered the happiness she had brought Samuel before pneumonia stole her away. Maybe they wanted to believe that kind of happiness could come twice. That second chances existed for people who had already lost everything that mattered. Inside the church, benches filled quickly. The building could hold perhaps 60 people if they packed in tight, and today they packed in tight. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, children perched on their parents' laps. Men stood along the back wall when the seats ran out. The minister, Reverend Carlyle, waited at the front. He was an old man with kind eyes and hands gnarled from a lifetime of work before God called him to preaching. He had married Samuel and Sarah 8 years ago, had buried Sarah 3 years ago, had watched Samuel's light go out and wondered if it would ever return. Now he watched the man walk up the aisle with a woman on his arm and a child between them, and he smiled. William Ashford arrived just as Reverend Carlyle stepped forward to begin. He came through the door like a storm, his expensive coat swirling, his face flushed with cold and anger. The crowd parted reluctantly, whispers rippling through the assembled townspeople like wind through leaves. This is madness, William snapped, his cultured Boston accent cutting through the frontier drawl of Bitter Creek like a blade. You can't do this. Kate turned to face him, and every person in that church saw her spine straighten, saw her chin lift, saw her transform from uncertain woman to immovable force. I already am, she said calmly, and I'm not asking your permission. Samuel stood at her side, solid and unyielding as Montana granite. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of two people who fit together despite never planning to. Kate didn't pull away. William's face darkened. This is a mistake, Catherine. You're throwing away everything. Your family, your future, your place in society. The society that valued you over honesty, Kate replied. The family that sent you to retrieve me like lost property, that future died the moment you chose someone else. This is my choice, mine, and I choose him. The minister spoke plainly, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom earned through witnessing joy and sorrow in equal measure. There were no flowers, no music, no elaborate ceremony, just truth spoken aloud in front of witnesses who would remember. Do you, Samuel Harper, make this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to stand with her from this day forward in plenty, and in want, in joy, and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Samuel said without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. The voice of a man who had found his footing after years of stumbling in darkness. Do you, Catherine Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to stand with him from this day forward in plenty, and in want, in joy, and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Kate answered, her voice ringing clear through the small church. No uncertainty, no doubt, just choice made freely, made fully made, with eyes open to exactly what she was choosing. A simple gold band appeared from Mrs. Turner's pocket, pressed into Samuel's palm with a knowing nod. The ring had belonged to her own mother, carried west in a wagon 60 years ago, worn through a long marriage and set aside when death claimed her husband. She had saved it for someone who would understand its value. Samuel slid it onto Kate's finger with hands that trembled slightly, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. The ring fit as if it had always belonged there, as if some things were meant to be found even by people who had stopped looking. When Reverend Carlyle declared them married, Emma clapped so hard her mittens nearly fell off. The sound echoed through the church, pure and joyful, breaking the tension that had held the crowd frozen. William stood frozen in the aisle, his face pale with fury and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he hissed, but the words lacked conviction. Everyone in that church could see he had already lost. Kate met his gaze one last time. "I already survived you," she said quietly, "and that taught me exactly what I'm capable of surviving." They left the church together, husband and wife and daughter, walking into the cold sunlight as if stepping into something newly born. Behind them, the congregation erupted into conversation, some celebrating, some scandalized, all understanding they had witnessed something significant. Back at the ranch, Samuel lifted Kate over the threshold with awkward determination, nearly hitting her head on the doorframe in the process. Emma laughed, racing ahead to declare the house officially theirs, as if her declaration could make permanent what felt impossibly fragile. That night by the fire, Samuel took Kate's hands in his. The house had settled into quiet. Emma, asleep in her bed, the world outside dark and cold and distant. "I won't promise perfection," he said, his voice low and rough. "I won't promise I'll always know the right thing to say or do. I won't promise that loving me will be easy." Kate squeezed his hands. "That's not what I want." "What do you want?" "Honesty. Partnership. Someone who sees my scars and doesn't run." "I can promise that," Samuel said. "I can promise I'll show up every day. I'll work hard. I'll protect you and Emma with everything I have. I'll try to be worthy of the choice you made today." "You already are," Kate whispered. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the violent storm that had greeted Kate's arrival, but gentle flakes drifting down like blessing. Like the universe acknowledging that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Marriage did not change the ranch overnight. The house was still small. The work was still hard. The past still lived in quiet corners, Sarah's presence woven into the fabric of the place in ways that couldn't be erased and shouldn't be. But something essential had shifted, like a door finally left open to let air move through rooms that had been sealed too long. Kate learned the rhythms quickly, her competence turning routine tasks into shared rituals. Morning fires built together while Emma still slept. Feeding animals before breakfast became a conversation without words, each of them knowing what the other needed without having to ask. The steady work of keeping a household breathing transformed from burden into partnership. Samuel watched Kate from a distance at first, as if afraid she might vanish if he looked too closely, as if the whole thing might be a fever dream that would dissolve in daylight. But Emma never gave him that chance. The child refused to let either adult retreat into old patterns of isolation. Mama, Emma said freely now, the word falling from her mouth like it had always belonged there. She said it, testing boundaries, watching to see if Kate would correct her, if Samuel would object, if the name would somehow summon Sarah's ghost to reclaim what had been hers. But Kate only smiled and answered, and Samuel's eyes grew soft when he heard it. Each time Emma said it, Kate felt both humbled and terrified by the weight of it. Being called Mama was a responsibility she had never expected to carry a trust. She wasn't sure she deserved a gift she was determined to honor. They moved carefully with one another in those first weeks. Samuel did not rush Kate into intimacy beyond the simple fact of sharing a home. Kate did not try to erase the woman who had come before her. They negotiated the space between them with the delicacy of people who knew how badly things could break if handled wrong. Sarah's shawl still rested on the chair by the fire. Her sampler still hung on the wall, careful stitches forming words of scripture and hope. Her books lined the shelf by the window. Instead of resenting these remnants, Kate learned to live alongside them, understanding that Sarah's memory was part of what made this family whole. One evening, as snow softened into early thaw and the first hints of spring whispered in the wind, Emma made an announcement that stopped both adults in their tracks. "We should plant something," she said with the seriousness of someone who had thought long and hard about this. "So Mama Sarah and Mama Kate are both part of the house. So everyone knows they both belong here." Samuel froze his hands, stilling on the harness he was mending. Then slowly, carefully, he nodded. "A tree," he said. "Trees last." They planted it together on the hill behind the barn, where the wind was gentler and the soil drained well. A slender sapling that Samuel had traded for with a neighbor, an apple tree that would take years to bear fruit, but would stand for generations if it survived. Emma packed the earth with her boots, her small body jumping up and down to compress the soil around the roots. Kate pressed her palms to the ground, feeling the cold earth, the promise of spring, the hope that something planted could grow. Samuel stood back quiet and reverent, his hat in his hands. When the tree was settled, Emma took both women's hands, one living and one remembered. "This is for both my mamas," she said, "so I never forget where I came from and where I'm going." That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, Samuel slept in his own bed. Not in the chair where grief had kept him company, not half awake and listening for threats that never came. He slept with his wife beside him, her warmth real and present, her breathing steady in the darkness. It wasn't replacement, it was continuation. The difference mattered more than words could express. Spring came hesitant but real, the way hope returns to people who have learned not to trust it too much. Mud replaced snow, turning the roads into thick, sucking morass that made travel difficult. Green pushed through stubborn ground, wildflowers blooming in unlikely places. Life insisting on itself despite the harsh winter that had tried to kill it. Kate wrote letters she never sent, pouring her thoughts onto paper and then burning them in the fire. Letters to her mother explaining why she had stayed in Montana, why she had chosen this life. Letters to the woman William had married and then discarded, apologizing for unknowingly being part of his pattern of using people. Letters to the girl she had been when she boarded that train east, telling her it would hurt worse before it got better. But that better was coming. She burned them all because some conversations could only happen with yourself, and sometimes the act of writing was enough without needing anyone to read the words. Kate learned to ride properly, Samuel teaching her with patience that surprised them both. He wasn't gentle about it, didn't coddle or make allowances for her being a woman or being new to horses. But he was patient, explaining what she needed to know, correcting without criticism, trusting her to learn. When William's name surfaced in town gossip brought by travelers passing through with news from the east, it no longer reached Kate with any power to wound. She heard that the Ashford family's bank had failed, that William had fled Boston ahead of fraud charges, that the woman he had married had left him the moment his money ran out. Kate felt nothing but distant pity. That man had never had the power to destroy her. She had given him that power by believing she needed his approval, his choice, his validation. Now she knew better. One evening, as sunlight spilled gold across the plains and painted the world in shades of honey and amber, Samuel took Kate's hands and said the words he had been carrying for weeks. "I love you." Simple, direct, honest. The way Samuel said everything that mattered. Kate believed him. Not because the words were pretty or poetic or wrapped in romance, because they were true, because she could see the truth of them in the way he made sure she ate enough, in the way he listened when she spoke, in the way he stepped between her and anything that threatened harm. "I love you too," she said, and watched something fundamental shift in his eyes. Relief, maybe? Or wonder that such a thing could happen twice in one lifetime. The words did not replace the past. They made room beside it, creating space for both grief and joy to exist in the same heart. The second winter arrived quieter than the first, snow falling gently, this time soft and patient, settling over the ranch like a promise kept. The house held its warmth better now, not because of thicker walls, but because of shared breath, shared laughter, shared silence that no longer hurt. Emma grew taller, louder, braver with each passing month. She learned to read by the fire while Kate mended and Samuel sharpened tools. Sometimes she read aloud, stumbling over long words, proud of every victory. Samuel listened like each sentence was a gift, his rough hands stilling on whatever work occupied them, his full attention on his daughter's voice. On the hill, the young tree stood thin but alive, its branches bare but unbroken. Samuel checked it often, as if guarding something sacred. He never said what the tree meant to him, but Kate understood. It was proof that loss didn't have to be the end, that new life could grow from the same ground that held grief. One afternoon, with snow falling soft outside the window, Emma asked the question they had all been waiting for. "Will Mama Sarah be mad?" she asked quietly, her small voice uncertain. "That we're happy without her," Samuel stilled. Kate set her sewing aside. This moment mattered more than most, and they both knew it. "No," Samuel said at last, his voice rough with emotion. "She'd want us warm. She'd want you happy. She wouldn't want us frozen in the place where we lost her." "Love doesn't get smaller when it's shared," Kate added softly. "It grows. Your Mama Sarah loved you so much, and she'd want you to have all the love you can get, including mine." Emma nodded, satisfied with this truth, and went back to her book as if the weight of the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. That night, Samuel woke from a dream he hadn't had in years. Sarah's face smiling, not fading or accusing, but peaceful. In the dream, she had touched his face and whispered something he couldn't quite hear, but he woke with the feeling that she had given permission for something he hadn't known he needed permission for. He reached for Kate in the darkness, grounding himself in what was real. She stirred her fingers, finding his without words, understanding in the way people who truly knew each other understood. In town, people stopped whispering eventually. The story changed shape as stories do, transformed from scandal to something else, from pity to respect, from judgment to acknowledgement that survival came in many forms and love was rarely simple. Kate became Mrs. Harper in truth, not just in name. The woman who kept Samuel's books with the same precision she had kept her father's. The woman who could set a broken bone and deliver a calf and shoot straight when predators threatened the herd. The woman who read to children at the church social and taught Emma and three other girls their letters. Samuel became a man who smiled again, not often but genuinely when it happened. The transformation was subtle enough that people who saw him every day barely noticed, but those who had known him before Sarah's death and after Kate's arrival could see the difference clearly. Late one evening, as the fire burned low and Emma slept soundly in her bed, Samuel spoke words he had been carrying since the station platform months ago. "I stopped that day because Emma spoke," he said quietly. "Because she said you looked like Sarah, but I stayed because you did." Kate leaned her head against his shoulder. "I didn't come here to be saved," she replied. "I came here to live." Outside wind moved through the plains, no longer a threat, but a song that finally knew the words. The kind of song that spoke of endurance and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let loss have the final word. And in the quiet that followed, Samuel understood something simple and final. The past had not loosened its hold on him. He had gently, lovingly set it down, had made peace with it, had given it a place of honor without letting it consume the present. Sarah would always be Emma's first mother, the woman who gave her life. But Kate was the woman who would raise her, teach her, stand beside her through all the years ahead. Both mattered, both belonged. Love was large enough to hold them all. Spring returned without asking permission, just as winter once had. This time it stayed, bringing warmth that melted the last of the snow and coaxed green from the reluctant earth. The tree on the hill bloomed in shy white petals, fragile but determined. Kate stood beneath it with Emma, both of them watching the wind carry blossoms across the grass like scattered promises finally kept. "It lived," Emma said proudly, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Kate replied, her throat tight with emotion. "It did." Samuel watched them from the fence line, his chest tight with a feeling he no longer tried to name or control. Life had not returned what it had taken from him. That was impossible. The dead stayed dead, and no amount of wishing could change that fundamental truth. But life had given him something different, something earned rather than given. something built through choice and work and the daily decision to keep trying even when trying hurt. That afternoon, they rode into Bitter Creek together, not out of necessity, but choice. Kate walked beside Samuel through town, no longer watching the ground, no longer bracing for judgment. Her head was high, her hand in his, her place in this community earned through months of proving herself in all the small ways that mattered on the frontier. People nodded as they passed. Some smiled. The past stayed quiet, no longer demanding constant attention, content to rest in memory rather than dominating the present. At the church, Emma lit 2 candles. One for Mama Sarah, who started it, she said solemnly. One for new beginnings. Kate added a stone at the base of each candle, a ritual of her own making. One for love that was lost, she said quietly. One for love that was found. Samuel added a third stone between them. One for love that continues, he said. Back at the ranch, as dusk settled soft and gold over the land, Samuel took Kate's hands and spoke the truth he had learned too late and just in time. I thought loving again meant forgetting. He said, I was wrong. Kate squeezed his fingers, the gold band on her hand catching the last light. Love remembers, she said, and still moves forward. They stood together on the porch as stars emerged one by one, steady and unafraid. Emma leaned against them both, fitting perfectly between her small body, the bridge connecting past and future grief and hope, loss and love. Years later, when Emma was grown and telling this story to her own children, she would tell it simply. How her father stopped a wagon in the snow. How a bride didn't disappear when the world gave her every reason to. How a family chose each other piece by piece, day by day, through all the small moments that added up to a life. But for now, there was only this moment. The wind moving through the grass with the whisper of promises kept. The light fading to purple and gold. The quiet certainty that some endings were only beginnings in disguise. And in the place where grief once lived alone, love remained. Not replacing what was lost. Not pretending the past never happened. But building something new from the materials at hand, creating shelter large enough to hold both memory and hope, both sorrow and joy. The tree on the hill grew taller each year, its roots reaching deep into Montana soil, its branches spreading wide enough to shade the family that tended it. In summer, it bore fruit, sweet and abundant. In winter, it stood bare but strong, weathering storms because its foundation was solid. Like the people who planted it, the tree endured. And that endurance, that stubborn insistence on growing despite everything that tried to stop it, became its own kind of triumph. Kate never forgot the girl who stood on that platform in a ruined wedding dress with nowhere to go and no one to want her. But she no longer was that girl. She had become someone else, someone stronger, someone who knew that worth was earned through character rather than circumstances, that dignity could survive anything, that love was something you built rather than something you waited to find. Samuel never forgot Sarah, the woman who had given him Emma, and 5 years of happiness before death claimed her. But he learned that hearts could hold more than one love, that moving forward wasn't betrayal, that healing didn't require forgetting. Emma grew up knowing she had been loved by 2 mothers, saved by both in different ways, shaped by both into someone who understood that family was something you created through choice as much as blood. And on winter evenings when snow fell soft outside and the fire burned warm inside, the 3 of them sat together in the small house that had learned to hold joy again. Samuel reading, Kate mending Emma, practicing her letters. An ordinary scene in an ordinary home. But ordinary was enough. Ordinary was everything. Ordinary was the miracle they had built from the wreckage of broken dreams and shattered hearts. The mail-order bride who looked like a ghost became the woman who brought a house back to life. The widower who had sworn never to love again learned that the heart was more resilient than he had known. The child who had lost her mother found that love could grow in unexpected places if you were brave enough to let it. And if you listened closely on quiet nights, you could almost hear 2 women's voices harmonizing in the wind. One who had lived in this house and loved it. One who lived in it still and loved it now. Both part of the same story, the same family, the same legacy of choosing hope, even when hope seemed like the most foolish choice of all. The end was also a beginning. The loss was also a gift. The stranger became family, and family became home, and home became the place where broken things went to be made whole again. Not healed, perhaps. Some wounds never fully heal, but whole in a different way. Whole the way a broken bone is stronger at the break. Whole the way a scar tells the story of survival. Hold away a life pieced back together from shattered fragments becomes something more beautiful for having been broken. If this tale stirred your heart, if you found truth in these words, if you recognized yourself in the struggle to keep going when everything falls apart, then know this: love refuses to die. Hope insists on returning. And sometimes the best things in life come not when we're looking for them, but when we've stopped looking and started living instead. Until the next tale, remember that second chances exist for those brave enough to take them, that families are built as much as born, and that the human heart has a capacity for resilience that exceeds our every expectation.